The summer of 1941 brought the Soviet Union its most brutal test. On June 22nd, Hitler's Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive offensive on the Eastern Front that placed the Red Army in an extraordinarily difficult position. Serious miscalculations by the USSR's military and political leadership led to the collapse of the front. The Wehrmacht acted with lightning speed. Enemy tank and motorized groups advanced deep into Soviet territory at incredible pace, exploiting gaps in the defense. In the first weeks of the war, Soviet forces suffered enormous losses, retreating under enemy pressure. The aerial situation proved equally critical. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, delivered a devastating blow to frontline airfields on the very first day of the offensive, destroying hundreds of Soviet aircraft on the ground. The Red Army was left without adequate air cover, further complicating the defense. Panic gripped both the troops and civilian population. In many places, chaos reigned. Communication between units was frequently lost, and orders either failed to reach their recipients or were executed with fatal delays. The chaos at the front was compounded by the rapid advance of German forces, which threatened to capture key industrial regions. Recognizing the danger of losing defensive capabilities, Soviet leadership hastily began evacuating factories eastward. This process required enormous effort. Equipment was dismantled, loaded onto trains, and transported beyond the Urals to preserve the ability to produce weapons. However, evacuation could not instantly compensate for losses, and the army faced acute shortages of everything, from aircraft and tanks to ammunition and fuel. The state of aviation proved particularly painful. The destruction of aircraft at airfields during the first days of war left the Soviet Air Force in dire straits. Many pilots who survived had no aircraft for combat missions, while new planes had not yet been manufactured or delivered. Moreover, the enemy's rapid advance complicated the organization of air defense. Airfields were either captured or abandoned during the retreat. Under such conditions, Soviet forces remained vulnerable to Luftwaffe attacks, which dominated the skies while supporting the Wehrmacht's advance. This situation forced the Stavka to seek any means to stabilize the front and fill gaps in armament. It was at this critical moment that Great Britain extended a helping hand to the Soviet Union. Although relations between the two countries were far from friendly, the common threat forced them to reconsider their priorities. In 1941, it became clear that joining forces might stop the Nazi war machine. This decision became the first step toward cooperation that, despite all difficulties, would play an important role in the war. Against the backdrop of the catastrophic situation on the Eastern Front, the British proposal to send aviation reinforcements appeared as a life-saving gesture capable of at least partially strengthening Soviet defenses. The situation at the front demanded swift and decisive action. Soviet leadership understood that without external support, the chances of containing the enemy offensive diminished with each passing day. At the same time, Great Britain, though facing its own problems, saw in helping the USSR a way to draw part of the Wehrmacht's forces away from Western Europe. This mutual interest became the foundation for subsequent events that unfolded in the north of the Soviet Union in the autumn of 1941. The next part of our story will tell how this cooperation began and what motivated two such different allies to unite against a common enemy. Relations between the Soviet Union and Great Britain on the eve of 1941 could hardly be called friendly. Throughout the preceding years, both countries had mutually distrusted each other, attempting to direct Hitler's Germany's aggressive ambitions toward their rival. The British saw in communist ideology a threat to their imperial interests, while Soviet leadership suspected the West of wanting to weaken the USSR through Nazi hands. This mutual distrust had been forming for years through political maneuvering and diplomatic games. However, Germany's attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941 radically changed the situation. Both Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, despite all ideological differences, quickly realized that Nazi Germany could only be defeated through joint efforts. Neither country alone had sufficient strength to stop the Wehrmacht, which at that time seemed invincible. Churchill, known for his pragmatism, understood that supporting the Soviet Union represented a strategic move of paramount importance. Maintaining the Eastern Front diverted significant German forces from Western Europe, where Britain was waging its own struggle. For Stalin, Allied assistance was vital given the catastrophic losses of the Red Army. Both leaders, despite mutual distrust, saw in the alliance the only path to survival. Therefore, when the Eastern Front began to collapse and Soviet aviation suffered devastating blows, a decision was made to take concrete steps toward cooperation. One of the first such steps was sending the British 141st Wing of the Royal Air Force to the Soviet Union. This operation received the code name Force Benedict and aimed to strengthen defenses in the north of the USSR, where German forces threatened strategically important ports. The decision to send the air wing combined military and political objectives. For Churchill, it was a way to demonstrate to the Soviet Union readiness for cooperation despite previous disagreements. For Stalin, the presence of British forces on Soviet territory was a compromise, as he always sought to minimize foreign influence on his citizens. However, necessity forced him to agree to this step. Importantly, Operation Force Benedict envisioned limited British involvement. Initially, plans called for sending a mixed group of fighter, bomber, and reconnaissance squadrons, but ultimately the composition was reduced to 2 fighter units. This decision reflected a cautious approach by both sides. Britain didn't want to risk large quantities of its resources, while the USSR tried to limit foreign presence. Organizing the operation required careful planning. British command understood that sending forces to the Soviet Union had to occur under strict secrecy. Any information leak could attract the attention of German intelligence services, potentially compromising the entire plan. Additionally, logistical challenges had to be considered. Transporting aircraft, personnel, and equipment across the Arctic Ocean was a risky undertaking. But this very route, known as the convoy route to Arkhangelsk and Murmansk, became the foundation for delivering British aid. For Churchill and Stalin, Operation Force Benedict became the first test of their ability to work together. The success of this endeavor would show whether further coordination between the two countries in fighting their common enemy was possible. This step also held symbolic significance. At a time when the Soviet Union stood on the brink of catastrophe, the arrival of British pilots provided practical support and signaled that the USSR had allies in this war. Although cooperation was driven by necessity, it laid the groundwork for future joint efforts, particularly the Lend-Lease program, which became vital for Soviet defense. The British prepared for this operation using various tricks to maintain secrecy, and their journey to the north of the Soviet Union was filled with challenges and unexpected circumstances. Operation Force Benedict required meticulous planning and maximum secrecy from the British command. Transporting the 151st Wing of the Royal Air Force to the Soviet Union posed an enormous military and logistical challenge, as delivering aircraft and personnel across the Arctic Ocean during wartime carried colossal risks. The British command deployed a complex disinformation campaign. Officially, they announced that the air group was preparing for deployment to North Africa, where Britain was actively fighting against Axis forces. This cover story was designed to convince everyone, including their own military personnel, that the final destination would be the hot deserts, rather than the entirely different expanses of Soviet territory. To create a believable cover story, the command resorted to clever measures. All selected personnel underwent vaccination against tropical diseases, including malaria and fever, which seemed logical for an African mission. The aircraft were equipped with special filters for desert climate operation, and their camouflage matched colors suitable for the North African theater of operations. These measures maintained the illusion of preparation for an entirely different assignment. Only a narrow circle of officers knew the operation's true purpose. Even the pilots and technicians remained unaware until the very last moment. The expeditionary force consisted of 2 fighter squadrons equipped with Hawker Hurricane aircraft, reliable but somewhat outdated fighters by that time. In total, they prepared 40 Hurricanes, of which 24 were to be transported in fully assembled condition on the deck of the aircraft carrier HMS Argus. The decision to transport assembled aircraft proved unusual, as Hurricanes had never been carrier-based before. However, it allowed them to save precious time, as the aircraft could immediately enter combat after arrival. The remaining 15 aircraft were transported in disassembled form in shipping containers for assembly on site. Besides the aircraft, they deployed approximately 500 servicemen, including pilots, technicians, and other personnel necessary to ensure the wing's combat operations. Transportation to the Soviet Union was organized through the Dervish Convoy, one of the first Arctic convoys delivering aid to the ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. To avoid attacks by German submarines or aircraft, the transport ships departed ports individually, meeting escort vessels in open sea near the southern part of the Orkney Islands. There, far from prying eyes, the 500 operation participants were finally told the true purpose of their journey, the Soviet Union. This news came as a genuine surprise to many, as most had been preparing for entirely different climate and conditions. The journey lasted 2 weeks, and fortunately, the dervish convoy avoided serious incidents. German reconnaissance aircraft or submarines never detected the ships, allowing them to reach the Kola Peninsula unimpeded on August 28, 1941. After arrival, the convoy split up. Transport and cargo ships headed to the safer port of Arkhangelsk, where unloading and aircraft assembly would take place. The aircraft carrier HMS Argus, carrying the assembled Hurricanes, remained at sea 300 kilometers from the Soviet coast, accompanied by several escort destroyers. The carrier's commander waited for favorable weather conditions, as takeoff from the deck for aircraft not designed for this purpose carried enormous risks. Only a week later, on September 7th, weather conditions allowed the operation to begin. This preparation phase was just the beginning of the complex journey for British pilots toward combat operations on Soviet soil, which we'll describe in the next part. The 2-week journey across the Arctic Ocean concluded on August 28, 1941, when the dervish convoy reached the Kola Peninsula. For the British pilots and technicians, a new phase of Operation Force Benedict began, deploying forces on Soviet territory. HMS Argus, with 24 assembled Hawker Hurricane fighters, remained at sea 300 kilometers from the coast, accompanied by several escort destroyers. The carrier's commander awaited favorable weather conditions, as takeoff from the deck posed a serious challenge. The Hurricanes were designed for land-based operations, so safe takeoff required strong headwinds to help the aircraft gain necessary speed on the short deck. The wait stretched for an entire week. On September 7th, weather finally became favorable. In the morning, the roar of 24 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines at full power shattered the silence of the polar sea. Taking off from HMS Argus's deck demanded extreme precision, as the short runway left minimal room for maneuvering. To increase chances of success, half the aircraft's armament was removed, and fuel tanks were filled with minimal amounts to reduce weight. The carrier's captain turned the ship into the wind and ordered maximum speed, creating additional airflow. Despite careful preparations, 2 Hurricanes barely avoided disaster. During takeoff, their landing gear clipped the ski jump, leaving debris on the deck. However, the pilots miraculously managed to level their aircraft just above the water. The remaining 22 aircraft took off without incident. A destroyer helped with navigation, precisely indicating the direction to the Soviet coast, a critically important task due to magnetic anomalies in the Barents Sea. After 80 minutes, all fighters landed safely at the Soviet airfield. Meanwhile, in Arkhangelsk, work began on assembling the 15 Hurricanes that arrived in disassembled form in shipping containers. A group of 40 British engineers led this process, but it quickly became clear that the task would require a creative approach. Some necessary tools were missing from the containers, complicating the work. The solution involved enlisting local craftsmen who manufactured the needed equipment based on improvised sketches literally drawn on the spot. An even bigger problem was fuel. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engines powering the Hurricanes required 100-octane gasoline, which the Soviet Union couldn't produce at that time. Soviet fuel had lower quality, and its use threatened engine damage. To solve this problem, British and Soviet technicians urgently developed a special adaptive catalyst that allowed engines to run on low-octane gasoline. This technical compromise demonstrated quick adaptation to local conditions, though it required additional effort. Thanks to close cooperation with the Soviet side, assembly of the 15 aircraft was completed in a record 9 days. This allowed the 151st Wing to be fully ready for combat operations much faster than expected. The base became Vyenga Airfield, located just 24 kilometers from the front line. This small facility, surrounded by dense taiga forest, already served as home to the 4th Fighter Squadron of the 72nd Mixed Aviation Regiment of the Northern Fleet. The arrival of the British meant the beginning of close interaction between 2 groups of pilots who, despite different traditions and experience, shared a common goal: stopping the enemy. Conditions at the airfield were harsh, but the Soviet side impressed the British with their organization. Local residents constructed earthen shelters for the 39 Hurricanes in a single day, whereas similar work in England would have taken at least a week. This speed and efficiency became the British pilots' first introduction to the Soviet approach to work under extreme conditions. On September 12, 1941, the British 151st Fighter Wing began combat operations from VNG-1 airfield, located just 24 kilometers from the front lines. The airfield, surrounded by dense taiga forest, already served as a base for the 4th Fighter Squadron of the 72nd Mixed Air Regiment of the Northern Fleet, commanded by the experienced ace Boris Safonov. The Soviet pilots of this unit possessed significant combat experience and were considered among the strongest on this sector of the front. The British aviators also had aerial battles over England and other theaters of war behind them. Both sides sought to demonstrate their skill, creating an atmosphere of healthy competition while simultaneously needing to quickly establish effective cooperation. The first combat sorties of the British Hurricanes included patrols and attempts to intercept German aircraft. On September 12th, pairs of British fighters scrambled several times in response to the appearance of enemy aircraft. However, in the first hours, engaging the Luftwaffe proved difficult. The Germans avoided direct contact. The situation changed dramatically in the second half of the day when 6 Hurricanes spotted a German reconnaissance aircraft escorted by 5 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. The British, using anti-aircraft tracer fire for orientation, managed to approach the enemy unnoticed and attack. The fierce aerial engagement ended with the shooting down of 3 German aircraft, with 2 more recorded as probably destroyed. Losses proved inevitable. Sergeant Norman Smith failed to notice an enemy Bf-109 closing in on his tail. A short burst ended the life of the 20-year-old pilot. The loss was a painful blow to the British, but in the next battle on September 8th, in an engagement involving 8 aircraft from both sides, they had their revenge, destroying 4 enemy machines. Escorting Soviet PE-2 dive bombers to targets in the enemy rear became one of the key tasks of the 151st Fighter Wing. These fast aircraft required reliable protection from German fighters, and the British Hurricanes performed this role brilliantly. The PE-2 crews highly praised the skill of their allies, as the bombers returned to base without losses every time. The sorties of September 25th and 27 were particularly memorable when the British, covering Soviet aircraft, destroyed 5 German fighters. These successes strengthened trust between British and Soviet pilots, who began to understand each other's strengths more deeply. Soviet aviators were impressed by the maneuverability of the Hurricanes in combat, while the British noted the courage and coordination of the PE-2 crews. The conditions at VNG-1 airfield impressed the British with their organization. Soviet engineers and local residents demonstrated amazing speed in preparing infrastructure. Earth shelters for aircraft that would take a week to build in England were erected here in a day. The British were particularly impressed by the masterful camouflage of the airfield. Improvised hangars for aircraft were so well hidden in the forest that they were almost impossible to spot from the air. Such camouflage allowed effective concealment of equipment from German reconnaissance. However, the weather in the northern USSR created serious obstacles. At the end of September, snowfalls and blizzards began, which often forced pilots to remain on the ground. Weather conditions limited the number of combat sorties, but could not completely halt the wing's operations. Beyond combat missions, British and Soviet pilots found time for informal communication. Often evenings were spent in drinking contests where the British tried to outdrink their Soviet colleagues. Success came only once, when the British cleverly replaced vodka with gin. These moments helped build friendly relationships despite the language barrier and cultural differences. During the day, work continued non-stop. The British prepared to transfer their Hurricanes to Soviet pilots, which became the next important stage of the operation. Operation Force Benedict envisioned 2 main tasks: participation of the British 151st Fighter Wing in combat operations and transfer of skills for working with equipment that was arriving in the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program. The British Hurricanes, which had already proven themselves in battles at VNG-1 airfield, were to become part of the Soviet Air Force. To achieve this, Soviet pilots and technicians needed to be trained to effectively use these machines. The process began immediately after the British settled at the base and became an example of close cooperation between allies despite all difficulties. To train Soviet personnel, the British organized special courses right in the airfield barracks building. Classes were conducted during time free from combat sorties to ensure uninterrupted main operations. The program included theoretical and practical sessions focused on the features of construction, control, and maintenance of Hawker Hurricane aircraft. British instructors, including Flight Lieutenant Ross, were responsible for pilot training, while technical personnel were taught by experienced RAF engineers. Soviet technicians particularly impressed the British with their ingenuity and speed of learning. Most of them passed the strict final examination with excellent marks, which came as a pleasant surprise to instructors accustomed to longer training periods in Britain. Training pilots proved a more complex task. Soviet aviators, many of whom had experience flying I-16s or other Soviet aircraft, faced a number of challenges. The Hurricane required a different approach to control, particularly due to its technical features, such as the closed cockpit canopy. Many Soviet pilots, especially older ones, were accustomed to flying with an open canopy, which allowed better spatial orientation but reduced the aircraft's aerodynamic characteristics. This habit proved so deeply ingrained that the commander of Northern Fleet Aviation had to issue a special order with disciplinary punishments for failure to comply with the requirement to close the canopy during flight. One of the first students was Boris Safonov himself, the famous Soviet ace and commander of the 4th Squadron. His retraining became a symbolic moment, as Safonov was an experienced pilot and authority among his colleagues. After a 15-minute verbal instruction from Flight Lieutenant Ross, he declared his readiness for independent flight. Climbing into the Hurricane's cockpit, Safonov took off without hesitation, made 2 circles over the airfield, and began his landing approach. However, upon touching down, the aircraft's left wing clipped the ground, nearly causing a crash. Fortunately, catastrophe was avoided, but this incident became an important lesson. Many Soviet pilots who believed that after flying the I-16 they could easily master any aircraft reconsidered their attitude toward the British fighter. This episode emphasized that the Hurricane demanded careful preparation and respect for its characteristics. The retraining program lasted just over 3 weeks, which was an impressively fast pace considering the complexity of the task. By the end of October, 1 Soviet squadron was fully ready for combat use of the Hurricanes. On October 26th, these aircraft with Soviet identification markings made their first combat sortie. That same day, over Murmansk, they shot down their first enemy aircraft, a heavy twin-engine Bf-110 fighter. This success became an important step in the process of integrating British equipment into the Soviet Air Force. Later, from the pilots who completed training, the 78th Fighter Aviation Regiment was formed, which received all the Hurricanes transferred by the British. This regiment became the foundation for further use of Lend-Lease equipment on the Northern Front. After successfully completing the retraining program for Soviet pilots and transferring all Hawker Hurricane aircraft, Operation Force Benedict was approaching its logical conclusion. The 78th Fighter Aviation Regiment, formed from Soviet pilots who had mastered British aircraft, assumed full responsibility for operating the Hurricanes on the Northern Front. For the British 151st Wing, which had been based at Airfield VNG-1 since September 1941, it was time to conclude their mission. According to orders from London received by Wing Commander Major Isherwood, after transferring the aircraft to the Soviet side, personnel were to be redeployed. Initially, it was planned that the British would head to the Middle East, which would have meant a long and dangerous journey through Soviet territory. However, command wisely reconsidered this decision, and instead of the complex route through a country at war, it was decided to return the pilots and technicians home aboard ships of the next Arctic convoy. The return of the British to Great Britain became a symbolic moment. As the transport vessels departed from the Soviet coast, the pilots and technicians aboard heard the familiar roar of aircraft engines. Above their heads appeared a squadron of Hurricanes bearing Soviet identification markings. The aircraft, piloted by newly trained Soviet pilots, made several circles over the ships, waggling their wings. This gesture became a kind of gratitude from the Soviet side for support during a critical moment of the war. For the British, who had spent several weeks in the harsh conditions of the Kola Peninsula, this farewell flight became a moving confirmation that their mission had meaning. Despite the relatively modest scale of Operation Force Benedict, its results are difficult to overestimate. During their time in the USSR, British pilots shot down 15 German aircraft, which might seem like a small number against the enormous scale of the Eastern Front. However, the true value of the operation lay in its strategic impact. The presence of the 151st Wing in northern USSR during the critical autumn of 1941 helped stabilize the situation in the region. German forces, who sought to capture the strategically important ice-free ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, faced additional resistance in the air. This slowed their advance and gave the Red Army time to regroup and strengthen their defenses. Even more important was that Operation Force Benedict ensured the uninterrupted functioning of Arctic convoys, which delivered vital cargo to the USSR under the Lend-Lease program. The ice-free ports of the north became a key route for supplying weapons, equipment, fuel, and other resources, without which the Soviet army would have lost the ability to effectively resist the enemy. The successful transfer of Hurricanes and training of Soviet pilots allowed the Northern Fleet Air Force to strengthen its positions, which had a long-term effect on the region's defense. Additionally, the joint work of British and Soviet aviators became an example of how allies can cooperate under extreme conditions, overcoming language, cultural, and technical barriers. The operation also had symbolic significance. At a time when the Soviet Union was in a desperate situation, the presence of British pilots on Soviet soil became a signal that the struggle against Nazi Germany united the Allies. Although the operation's scale was limited, it laid the foundation for further cooperation within the Lend-Lease framework, which became critically important for the USSR in the following years of the war. Operation Force Benedict, despite its success, remained a unique episode in cooperation between Great Britain and the Soviet Union during World War II. After the 151st Wing returned home, close interaction between Royal Air Force fighter units and Soviet Air Force units on the Northern Front ceased. Instead of continuing joint combat operations, the British presence in the region was limited to the activities of individual reconnaissance squadrons that monitored German surface ship movements in Norway. The cooperation that had shown its effectiveness unexpectedly ended. The reasons for this lie in a complex combination of political, ideological, and strategic factors that influenced the decisions of both sides. British leadership, despite the necessity of alliance with the USSR, maintained deep distrust of communist ideology. For many in London, the Soviet Union remained a potential rival, even in the midst of war with Nazi Germany. Sending experienced pilots and valuable equipment far from their own borders seemed risky and an unwanted dispersal of resources. Great Britain was fighting on several fronts, in North Africa, in the Atlantic, in the skies over Europe, and every aircraft, every pilot was critically important for the Empire's survival. Operation Force Benedict was planned from the beginning as a short-term mission aimed at quickly strengthening Soviet defenses and demonstrating solidarity. After completing these tasks, British command preferred to focus on their own priorities, redirecting resources to where they could directly protect the Empire's interests. On the Soviet side, there were also serious reservations. Joseph Stalin, known for his suspicion of foreign influence, sought to minimize contact between Soviet citizens and representatives of Western countries. The presence of British pilots and technicians on Soviet territory, although necessary at a critical moment, was perceived as a potential threat to ideological purity. Stalin and his circle feared that close communication with foreigners might influence the morale of military personnel and civilians, especially during wartime when propaganda played a key role. This distrust of allies, even those providing assistance, permeated all Soviet policy of that time. Therefore, when the Hurricanes were transferred and Soviet pilots mastered their use, the need for further British presence disappeared. Both sides had different strategic priorities that rarely intersected. For Great Britain, the key was ensuring their own security and protecting their colonies, while the USSR focused on survival in the struggle against the Wehrmacht. The joint operation in the north arose from extreme necessity but became an exception that confirmed the rule about divergent interests. Soviet command preferred to rely on their own forces and Lend-Lease supplies, which provided material support without the constant presence of foreign troops. The British, for their part, believed that their contribution in the form of aircraft, equipment, and training had already fulfilled its role and allowed their Soviet allies to independently continue the struggle. Despite the end of close cooperation, Operation Force Benedict left a noticeable mark in the history of the alliance. It proved that even under complex political conditions, allies are capable of coordinating their actions for a common goal. The success of transferring the Hurricanes and training Soviet pilots became an important step in strengthening the Northern Fleet Air Force, which helped protect the ice-free ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. These ports remained critically important for delivering Lend-Lease cargo that supported the Soviet economy and army during the war's most difficult years. Moreover, the operation became a rare example of direct contact between British and Soviet military personnel, which allowed both sides to better understand each other despite cultural and language barriers. Force Benedict became a small but significant page in the history of World War II. It demonstrated how pragmatic cooperation can produce results even under the most difficult conditions. Although political and ideological differences prevented the continuation of such operations, the contribution of British pilots to stabilizing the Northern Front remained an important element of the joint struggle against Nazism. This story reminds us that even short-term efforts can have long-term consequences if they are directed toward a common goal and executed with proper determination.